Is in the grip of the single worst drug crisis in its history by far. Every year, overdoses kill more Americans than died during the entire 11 years of the Vietnam War. Opioids, particularly fentanyl and heroin, are the main culprit. So what's the priority in Congress? Well, a bipartisan group of senators led by Chuck Grassley and Dick Durbin is trying to reduce criminal sentencing for drug smugglers. The Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act of 2017 would cut the mandatory minimum for example, for smuggling a kilogram of heroin across the border from 10 years to 5. Whitney Bone is a criminal defense attorney, and she joins us now. Whitney, thank you for coming on. I think most people 3 years ago, when they first heard about sentencing reform, had in mind low-level drug users, marijuana dealers, and they thought, you know, why are we sending these people away for life? And I think most people kind of agree with that. We should have some sentencing reform. But why in the middle of the worst drug crisis in American history, fueled by opioids, would you be reducing the sentence for a massive heroin trafficker? A kilo of heroin contains over 30,000 equivalent lethal doses of heroin. So why would you reduce the penalty for that?
The reason we reduce the penalty is not because we're going to reduce the penalty for every single drug trafficker, or as you've pointed out, drug smugglers who are bringing drugs across the border. What we're talking about here is due process. We're talking about constitutional rights of defendants to be sentenced in a way that's not a one-size-fits-all. And the bottom line is these judges that are serving on the United States Sentencing Commission and that are advising the Senate Committee on the Judiciary have compiled a lot of information that shows, you know what, there's no nexus between this draconian minimum mandatory sentencing, which is one-size-fits-all, and every single drug trafficking defendant. Not every drug trafficking defendant is someone smuggling heroin across the border. A lot of times people are charged with possession with intent to distribute or conspiracy with possession with intent to distribute, and they are essentially low-level dealers.
I understand that. I understand that. But the threshold for this reform in this bill is a kilo, 2.2 pounds of heroin. Once again, that's over 30,000 lethal doses of heroin. That's a huge amount.
That's right, Tucker, but it makes it discretionary. It makes it discretionary for federal judges. What it does is it takes a 10-year minimum mandatory and gives a judge discretion to do a 5-year minimum mandatory. We already have safety valves. We already have substantial assistance provisions which allow judges to go around minimum mandatories altogether in these drug trafficking cases.
Okay, so
however,
how about this?
What they've done is they've given judges more discretion.
Oh, right. Okay, no, I understand, but you're not really answering my question, so why don't I pose it this way? Why don't you paint for me a scenario where someone caught with a kilo of heroin should get less than 10 years in prison?
Well, I can paint you a really great scenario which happens every day in federal court, which is that individuals are charged with conspiracy, with possession with intent to distribute, which means that every person that's involved in this broader conspiracy, from the guy who took the phone call to tell the other guy to drive to the Wendy's to pick up the heroin from another guy, all of those guys are in the conspiracy, and every time a drug deal happens, those individuals are charged with the aggregate amounts of all of those drugs, and that's not necessarily representative of one guy's involvement who's probably an addict anyways.
Okay, you are answering right past my question. No, I'm saying the person who is in possession of a kilo, not the person who laundered his money, not the person who did his dry cleaning, but the person in possession of the kilo. 30,000 doses of heroin at a time when 50,000 Americans died of drug ODs last year. Is there not a statement that we can send when we say, you're caught with that, I'm sorry, you're actually in trouble, for real?
Well, actually, Tucker, a person who's just in possession of the heroin would not be falling under these sentencing reform provisions, because we're talking about trafficking and we're talking about distribution and manufacturing and possession with intent to distribute. Someone who just possesses the drugs is not even really facing a minimum mandatory necessarily under the same provisions that we're talking about here anyways. But
actually what you're saying is hold on, stop. I must stop you because you're being inaccurate. If you are in possession of a kilo of heroin, by definition, you are going to be charged with trafficking, period. You can't use 30,000 doses of heroin. You're selling it. So what you said is not true. But that person shouldn't get the same treatment as somebody who is carrying 10 kilograms over a period of 5 years, where maybe it's split up in less than a kilogram a deal. So that one person who has the 1 kilogram, the one time, isn't supposed to have the same treatment. Because conspiracy, so a lethal dose of heroin,
these are how federal prosecutors are charging these crimes, are conspiracy. And the reason they do that, Tucker, as you know, and as Jeff Sessions knows, is because they're trolling. You go after the little fish because where the little fish are, you get to the bigger fish. And if you're interested in fixing the problem, this is the way we do it. We don't just throw minimum mandatories at people and not give federal judges the ability to make discretionary decisions regarding sentencing so that people's
why do
due
you
process
think we
rights are
had
respected.
mandatory minimums in the first place? Because federal judges were letting these people go, and I'm sure with your help.
They still have ways around them now. You can come to federal court with me, Tucker. I promise you, they're not giving away the farm there. It's not happening. It's not happening.
Yeah. It's a frustrating conversation, Whitney. I'm sorry. Thank you, though, for coming on.
It's frustrating for all of us. Have a good night.
I bet it is. Twitter working to silence unwanted opinions, and most of the former civil libertarians on the left remain silent. Glenn Greenwald is a rare exception to that, and he joins us next. Stay tuned.